Legendary Eleanor Roosevelt was born on October 11, 1884, into a well-respected New York family of Elliott Roosevelt and Anne Hall. Having her uncle Theodore Roosevelt as president set Eleanor up for a politically successful life. Although she grew up in a wealthy household, she was constantly belittled by her physically sick mother and abandoned by her alcoholic father. Due to her mother's death and father's abandonment, Mrs. Roosevelt was orphaned. She and her two younger brothers were sent to live with their grandmother. When she was 15, her grandmother enrolled her in Allen's Wood boarding school in Southfield, England. While away, she gained confidence and security in herself to voice her opinions and be strong in her own beliefs. She returned home by her grandmother's request in 1902, only to further her education by becoming involved in hands-on work in sweatshops, cinema houses, and commercial establishments in New York City. Shortly after beginning her humanitarian work in New York, she met Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the love of her life. They married on March 17, 1905. In the first 12 years of their marriage, she birthed 6 children, one of whom died during infancy. Eleanor Roosevelt was more than an influential First Lady. She was an important political figure in history because of her commitment, persistence, and passion toward human and civil rights. Eleanor Roosevelt assumed the position of not only a wife and mother, but also filled the role of a wife to a political figure. Tragedy struck in 1921 when her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was diagnosed with polio. Serving as his political substitute, she became her husband's political eyes and ears in order to keep his governmental affairs afloat while he suffered from his disease. Although her educational background was considerably less than the average political figure, her worldly and political family experience gave her courage to step up to her newfound role, thus marked the beginning of her political career. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. During his presidency from 1933 to 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt continued her My Day newspaper column to the best of her ability. This column provided an insight into the mind of Miss Roosevelt and included popular topics of the day such as civil rights, women's issues, and political events. She wrote consistently 6 days a week, and she only stopped writing for a brief period of time in 1945 due to her husband's death, but only refrained for a mere 4 days. We cannot settle strikes by refusing to understand their causes. We cannot prepare for a peaceful world unless we give proof of self-restraint, of open-mindedness, and of courage to do right at home, even if it means changing our traditional thinking and for some of us to sacrifice our material interests. This quote was from an excerpt from a 1943 My Day article. She wrote diligently from 1935 up until her death in 1962. However, My Day was such a small part of her attribution to society. During her role as a First Lady, she lectured nationwide and spoke at many press conferences. While remaining true to her humanitarian efforts, she opened factories for the unemployed and opened the Todd Hunter School in New York. She found common ground with the middle class through her common sense platform. Through these works, she reached out to people who felt they did not have a voice in society. She addressed issues that were found in everyday life and clarified subjects that dealt with the real-life concern of the common human being, such as women's rights, safer working conditions, civil rights, and unemployment. The efforts made by the Roosevelts exemplified Eleanor's persistence to uphold the American people's respect. The civil rights movement acquired a much-needed ally in Eleanor Roosevelt. The beginning of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt presidency was when the issue of race was first brought to Eleanor Roosevelt's attention. In 1934, she began working closely with the director of the NAACP, Walter White. She proposed anti-lynching laws, causing a rift in her party and the Southern Democrats, challenging her husband's political agenda. In 1935, she created a Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, which promoted the idea of people achieving an education and then pursuing job opportunities. New Deal programs were focused on the poor, unemployed, and homeless with the main goal to get America working. These programs created by the New Deal affected African Americans because of their impoverished circumstances. Mrs. Roosevelt then brought black and white children together at the White House parties, toured black colleges, visited black churches, and contributed her name, money, and presidency toward black causes. Her actions and efforts towards such a controversial issue demonstrated her dedication to make a change to the well-being of every citizen. In the midst of her political hype, devastation struck with the death of her husband on April 12, 1945. This tragedy not only affected Eleanor Roosevelt, but also America as a whole. Even though her reign as First Lady had come to an end, her political career was far from over. It only took one exciting phone call from President Harry Truman to change the rest of her life. Knowing Eleanor's potential, Truman personally asked Eleanor Roosevelt to become a delegate to the United Nations. After being approved by the Senate, she was delegated to the United Nations and proceeded to England to begin her work. She shifted all of her focus to the United Nations in its efforts to form the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In her My Day column in 1953, Eleanor Roosevelt declared that she felt the most important things she could focus on would be strengthening the UN. She worked with the UN as a speaker, fundraiser, publicist, and volunteer organizer. While at the United Nations, she was one of the main contributors to the Declaration of Human Rights. Through her dedication, she gained the reputation of the nation's most respected and loved philanthropist. The year of 1948 was important for Mrs. Roosevelt. She gave a speech called The Struggle for Human Rights in September, proclaiming the importance of liberty, equality, and fraternity for every individual, and then 3 months later, the Declaration of Human Rights was passed. This was the culmination of all of the work that she had done in the past 3 years. Eleanor Roosevelt died on November 7, 1962, in New York City due to tuberculosis. For Mrs. Roosevelt, no task was ever too small, and no assignment was ever too large. She leaves us by saying, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are able to say to yourself, 'I have lived through this horror. I can take this next thing that comes along.' You must do the same thing you think you cannot do."